Hello again. We are going to talk some more about the anti-racism unit. This week, I've asked you to consider some ideas related specifically to white privilege and structural racism, and something I'm calling the mutability of whiteness. And those are the terms that I need to define for you a little bit. You'll see that I have an article posted to this week that you'll want to read. It's very brief. And someone who is really not much older than you changed something in the dictionary, got Merriam-Webster to change the dictionary because she argued in a letter to them that the definition they had for racism was somewhat out of date. We've talked about racism in one's own heart. In other words, if I think, that group of people over there, that's not my group of people, they're not as good as me because of who I am in my racial group. That's a form of racism that is, the way it manifests itself is very complicated, but it's pretty clear. I can also have something called internalized personal racism. In other words, I can decide that my group is no good. For instance, again, I'm only talking about me because I can't imagine trying to teach this without somebody getting offended unless you hear it about me. So I apologize if this feels like TMI, too much information. I'm not trying to make this class about me. I'm actually trying to use the things that will not offend you because it's about me and not about you in your own life. And all right, I'm telling you a story I've never told a class about a guy I dated briefly when I was in my 20s in New York. There was this guy who I met at he asked me out. He was an advertising executive, and he was black. And as you can see, I wasn't. I thought I was dating him because he was funny, successful, ambitious. These were all of the things that I thought were interesting and cool about him. I had trouble figuring out why he was dating me at first. He didn't seem to be responding to me. He would make statements about me, and I'm like, that doesn't quite sound like me. Why does he think that's true about me? And I would actually defy these things. And I do not recommend this as a strategy as an experiment. I started to ask questions about this because he was very patient and polite and interested in seeing me. But I realized that it was like he wasn't seeing me at all. He kept talking about me in terms that didn't sound like me, not rude terms, but more like assuming things about me that were crazy wrong. Like somehow that I was shy and retiring and, and so I did an experiment, and I don't recommend this. Don't do this. But all right, I did it. I showed up at our next date, drunk, really drunk. And I said outrageous things. I wasn't mean, but I was just wild. And he still acted as if I were acting like a lady at a country club, being very polite, having tea. And I'm like, hello, he doesn't see me. And then he invited me to a party that weekend. And it was a nice dinner party, very fancy dinner party in somebody's very beautiful house in a nice neighborhood in Brooklyn. And it was one of his colleagues who was also black and also an executive in advertising. So I dressed up very nicely. And when I went there, I had a little shock. Every man around this dinner table with 8 couples at the dinner were black. 8 women around the table were white. And I asked myself, what's wrong with white women, what's wrong with white men for these women, and what's wrong with black women for these men? why is everybody of the same racial makeup in a racially diverse city? It's not that it's segregated. It's not that I couldn't have brought him. In fact, I did bring him to parties with me where we were not the only interracial couple, and we weren't dating for like a million years. It wasn't like I was getting engaged to this guy. But I realized that I became pretty sure he was dating me because I was white. And I didn't want to date anybody. I was not dating him because he was black. I was dating him because I thought he was cool. And then I didn't like that. And I didn't want to be the white woman. I wanted to be the woman who has good and bad qualities in his life. So I broke up with him. 2 months later, on the street in New York, I ran into him and he was on a date. And the woman he was on a date with could have been my twin sister. I was, bingo. I was absolutely right. He has a type. Anything else can be going on in that type. And I don't want to be a type. And I imagine you yourself wish to be valued for who you are and not a type. I would argue that this man, who is still ambitious and successful, has an element of internalized racism. He doesn't quite feel comfortable with his own blackness, I think. And I could be wrong. If he were here to rebut me, he could say, you got it all wrong and that was awful and I'm not sorry we broke up because you were just difficult. And he'd be right. I was difficult, I'm sure. But my point is, I suspect he felt racist against himself. That's called internalized racism. There are multiple books about that. And if you ever take a graduate class in African American Studies, you'll read a book by a guy named Frantz Fanon, which is all about it. Super good book. In any case, that's internalized racism. And those are both forms of racism. But there's a kind of racism called structural racism. This young woman argued to Merriam-Webster Dictionary. And what structural racism is not that feeling of I'm better or I'm worse based on my race. It is about a system that distinguishes people one from another. I mean, the most obvious part of that system is our race-based history of slavery, but it's the history of segregation in terms of a legal matter with different drinking fountains and restrooms and lunch counters for one group and not another group. That's largely officially over, but there are structural things that still exist that are contributors to a system which is racist, which has nothing actually to do with the heart of the person. Again, I'm going to talk to you about structural racism briefly so that you can see it. And I'm only going to use my personal life, not because I think that this class is about me. It's so not. But because I don't want anyone to say I'm calling them a name or accusing them of a kind of racism, and I'm not. I'm not. This isn't about me calling you a name. I promise you. So back in my 20s, I dated a different guy. Like me, he was Irish American. It was, we were of the same exact group. So together, we were pretty much racially the same. But structurally, he observed racism in the system he was in. He was part of the criminal justice system. He was a junior level DA in New York. He was in the appellates division, which meant that he had to read the files and write a brief for the Court of Appeals about why someone who was in jail belonged in jail still for a crime if there was an appeal. And as a result of this, he would read every day the files of people. And what he said was he didn't want to do the job anymore. He wanted to be somebody who worked against business fraud crimes. And he ended up working for the SEC later. But the reason he did it was he said he read more and more files, particularly of poor people who were in communities of color. And what he observed was that even where he was convinced that the person had committed a crime of which they were truly guilty, he would read all the way back into their early childhood history, because often the state had a file on somebody who'd been taken into protective custody, things like this. And he realized that the young, particularly black men whose files he read, had, maybe some of them had really committed bad crimes, but that before they ever committed the crime, they had not gotten the same chance in life that he had or that I had. And he was able to observe that when he reflected on his own childhood and mine, neither of which I just want to say were perfect. I want to be super clear about that. I'm not saying we were like living in Buckingham Palace and we had butlers, or that our parents were the most loving Brady Bunch type family members you could ever have. But I am saying that there were things that he was able to recognize and talk to me about that he thought were fundamentally unfair on a structural level. It didn't mean that the person didn't deserve to go to jail, he thought, but he didn't want to be part of a system that was stacked against communities of color in New York City. And there's a whole lot to say about that, which we are not going to delve into in this class. But I wanted to give you one example of structural racism. I had to point it toward me so that nobody says, but you mean this, and you were talking about me, and you were talking about my dad, who's a DA. No, I'm not. I'm talking about my ex-boyfriend, Kevin. And if you have a beef with Kevin, I'll get him on the phone for you, all right? But you don't have a beef with, I didn't insult your mama, or your daddy, or your uncle, or your local county, whatever. I am talking about definitions, and I think if I aim them toward me, you can hear it. Whereas because there is so much tension right now in American culture, people may take some kind of exception. Sorry, I paused because someone was at my door. So structural racism, which I described, is not a feeling in one's personal heart, but a system where people experience racial prejudice against them because of the way that the society set that up. Another example of structural racism is called redlining, where banks up until, I want to say the 1970s or 80s, would lend no money in black neighborhoods for mortgages. It was illegal, or it is illegal now, but it still creates a distinction in value between, in a black neighborhood or white neighborhood, how much a house costs in America. That's not a topic for, pardon me, our lessons. But if you understand the idea that structures happen within a social system that exists, you will understand one of our works that we're reading called The First White President, an Atlantic article, which is part of a larger book ultimately that Ta-Nehisi Coates publishes, and talks about white privilege in America as it was structured from day one. Again, confronting history, like I said in my last video. White privilege is structured in such a way that even if you have zero racism in your heart as a white person, you benefit from it. Again, I'm going to talk about me because I don't want you to think that I'm being jerky to you or your mom or your grandma or anybody else. I'm not. But I can tell you that I have stood in Grand Central Station, Penn Station at night, where cops are telling people they have to leave because they're shutting down the station, and they talk to brown-skinned people one way, and they talk to me another. They are, yes, ma'am, I'm sorry, ma'am, we have to leave, you have to leave, but not to the brown people. It's very rude, and even, threatening them with arrest, and they're not moving any slower than me. I've seen it. Was that cop racist? Possibly. Was the system racist? Oh, yeah. Um, if I go to a concert in New York, again, I'm not even talking about the South now, so don't get all riled up, all right? If I go to a concert in the North and I go to Lincoln Center, where the rich white people go to hear opera, there will be guards all around. There will be security. There will be police, and they are quietly policing. I also used to go to clubs where there was music that was not opera. And when the cops came, everybody had to run, including the totally innocent people, because the cops were there to swing batons. Yes, even me, I had to run because structurally that was in a different kind of neighborhood where mostly people of color were were living, and the cops acted differently there. Was there individual racism and individual cops? I have no doubt. But more importantly, from a structural racist standpoint, I can tell you that cops at Lincoln Center, where the rich white people go, were told to act one way. And cops that went to the hip hop club where I would go watch my friend Q the Prophet freestyle were told to act in a different way when they showed up. So structural racism is something that we should consider in our discussion of anti-racism because we need to confront things like this. We need to be able to confront where racism lies. And the other thing that I mentioned that I wanted us to talk about today was white privilege. First of all, I mentioned that I gave you an example of white privilege just now. White folks at Lincoln Center get treated differently than concert goers in a black neighborhood. And I get treated differently all the time because of how I look. I see it happening in front of me. Not because I'm so beautiful, but I happen to be pale. Another thing that I wanted to talk about, golly, what was it? Oh, I wanted to talk about the mutability of whiteness. Let me explain this. Mutability means changeability. I look like this, and my ancestors look like this, and 1,000 years ago, I'm reasonably sure my ancestors had this skin color on the back of their hands, more or less, within a shade or two. That's what it was. But when my ancestors first got to the United States, Irish people were not considered white. Yes, you heard me right. Irish people were not considered 100% white. Neither were Italians, who, by the way, got lynched, I don't use the term lightly, in New Orleans. And their skin might have been a shade darker than mine, but not a lot. So when we talk about it being about skin color, whiteness as a category would have to have always included Jews in Europe, which it, believe me, it didn't. That's an entirely different course, anti-Semitism in Europe. And it would include a variety of other people. But I've got some videos that show you some examples of how Irish people were depicted. And again, I'm talking mostly about me, not because I think it's all about me. In fact, I don't think it's all about me, but that way nobody thinks I'm insulting them. My ancestors in America, when we totally lived here, often saw signs that said no Irish need apply. And that wasn't just they didn't like our accents, which I no longer have. But we were depicted as riotous, out of control, bestial characters that were compared to orangutans in cartoons and were made fun of on vaudeville as a working class, like basically Irish women were drunk sluts. You know, I take exception. I think that if I want to be funny, I would say, I'm rarely drunk. No, totally kidding, totally kidding. I'm neither drunk nor slutty. But my point to you is simply this, that Uh, Whiteness doesn't always categorize everyone with white skin, which makes it more complicated when we think about who gets white privilege at certain times and how people act like it's always been obvious who gets the special golden ticket to act to get treated a certain way, and it's not. I want us to think about that. So the terms to consider are white privilege. What privileges do you have, however poor you are, if you are white? However dysfunctional your crazy family is, if you are white. However down on your luck you are, if you are white. There are some things that don't happen the same way to white people as they do to Black people in the structural racism of America. And we're going to read something about that for us to consider. It does not mean that there aren't white people down on their luck or Black people who are born in a kind of excellent life. I imagine that if you're the child of a celebrity who is Black, you have more pairs of shoes in your closet than if you are born in Appalachia as a white person in America. I'm not suggesting that those material things are all the same. But even Oprah has told the story of going to some of the higher end boutiques in New York. And Oprah, as you know, has lots of money. And people would follow her around because all they would see when she showed up was a Black woman in the middle of her career. And they would follow around like they thought she was going to shoplift, or they wouldn't let her in the door at all because she was Black. And I've seen this, I've absolutely seen this. And by the way, if I go to the same boutique, and I promise you, I do not have any Oprah money in my back pocket, you would not want to sell me everything in a high-end boutique on Madison Avenue or Park Avenue. I don't have the money to pay for the entire Chanel boutique. I can probably get myself a couple of nice handbags, but I'll pretty much have to sell my dog and possibly my car. In any case, I wouldn't be let in the boutiques that Oprah was not let into. And so I have a kind of presumption of not being a maniac, horrible, bad person. People are willing to consider what merits I may have in a way that Black folks, it's almost like they come to the home plate in baseball and they already have one strike against them in American society. That's what I'm talking about, white privilege. That's what my ex-boyfriend Kevin was talking about when he left the DA's office. He didn't like the structural racism that engendered white privilege for him and me, even though, as like I said, neither of us came from a family that had, butlers. Just to be super clear. And then there is this idea that our ancestors as Irish Americans, we weren't even thought about as white before when we got here. We sure are thought of as white now. The KKK used to burn crosses in front of Irish Catholic churches. I kid you not, I did not make that up. That's like a thing. Now, they might come recruiting until I opened my mouth and I told them where to go. And then there is this idea of internalized racism. I think that's everything I wanted to tell you in this video. I've given you some terms. All of these videos are about the terms. We're going to read the works and consider what they have to say. I don't expect you to buy into everything they say necessarily, but I'm asking you to soberly and critically consider it, because I think that your world gets bigger when you consider ideas, even if you don't agree with them, to consider how you see the world. And sometimes I have said, oh, that can't be, until I see it, and then I see it. Let's all get a little more aware, conscious, deliberate in what we do as anti-racists.